So if you were just walking down a street in India back in the year 2000 and your pocket started ringing, you were basically part of this incredibly exclusive, very wealthy club.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a mobile phone back then was a massive luxury status symbol. It wasn't for the everyday person.
Right, exactly. But looking through this massive stack of sources we have for you today, there's just this incredibly jarring contrast. Because fast forward just 9 years, and you've got a fisherman in a wooden boat literally miles off the coast, using a mobile phone to check onshore market prices before he even docks.
Yeah, or a plumber using one to find daily wage work. It completely flipped.
It really did. And that's what we're doing today. We're looking at a single decade that completely rewired the DNA of a nation of over 1 billion people. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a heavy topic.
It is, yeah. Our mission for you today is to really understand exactly how India transitioned from this economic model that the sources refer to as the sluggish Hindu rate of growth into a 9% economic juggernaut.
And honestly, more importantly, we really need to unpack how the intense friction of that rapid change played out. I mean, across the country's politics, its culture, and its physical security.
Yeah, because it is a staggering transformation to analyze.
It really is. When you read through these documents, you realize pretty quickly that this isn't just a sequential history of a decade. It's like a real-time blueprint of how a modern superpower essentially grew up.
Right.
And the core contradiction we really have to grapple with today is the widening and often very painful gap between this soaring, globalized vision of what was called India shining and the reality of the Aam Aadmi, the common man.
The person who was just left standing on the ground basically watching this massive rocket take off without him.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer scale of what we're looking at it's difficult to wrap your head around. I mean, the sources cover everything from high-stakes international nuclear deals, catastrophic earthquakes, all the way to 1 rupee flight tickets and the birth of Bollywood multiplexes.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah. But to understand this explosion of economic and cultural activity, we first have to look at the political foundation that allowed it to happen. And ironically, the massive political miscalculation that almost derailed the whole thing.
Right. The politics of the era set the entire stage.
Because I'm looking at the notes on the late 1990s, and it seems like Indian politics was just incredibly volatile. We're talking about prime ministers lasting a matter of days or maybe months. But then, as we enter the 2000s, the sources talk about the stabilization of something called Coalition Dharma under Prime Minister A.B. Vajpayee.
Yeah, so that phrase coalition dharma, it essentially translates to the ethical duty, or I guess the rules of engagement for running a coalition government.
Okay, so playing nice with others, basically.
Exactly. You have to remember that the 1990s were marked by these really fractured mandates. No single party could win a clear majority. So when Atal Bihari Vajpayee takes office in 1999, leading the National Democratic Alliance, or NDA, he is managing a coalition of over a dozen different regional parties.
A dozen.
Wow. Yeah. And each of these parties has its own local agenda, its own specific voter base, and its own demands. So managing that requires just a profound level of political discipline and, frankly, compromise.
And from the sources, Vajpayee comes across as a really fascinating figure. Like, he was known for writing poetry, yet he was navigating this incredibly ruthless political landscape.
He was a very complex leader, yes.
He actually becomes the first prime minister outside of the historically dominant Indian National Congress Party to complete a full 5-year term. But the sources mention he achieved this by intentionally sidelining his own party's core ideological platforms.
He had to.
Specifically, they mention shelving the Ram Mandir issue and Article 370. For a listener who might be completely unfamiliar with Indian political history, what are those, and why was ignoring them such a massive gamble for him?
It's really vital context. So the Ram Mandir refers to a deeply contested religious site in the city of Ayodhya. For decades, Vajpayee's party, the BJP, had campaigned heavily on building a Hindu temple on the site where a mosque, the Babri Masjid, had been demolished in 1992.
And that demolition sparked nationwide riots, right?
It did. It was highly polarizing. And Article 370, on the other hand, was a constitutional provision that granted special autonomous status to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Revoking that was another core historical promise of the Hindu nationalist movement.
So these are basically the bedrock promises of his party.
Exactly. But Vajpayee recognized that his regional coalition partners, many of whom relied heavily on secular or minority votes in their home states, they would instantly abandon the government if he pursued these polarizing religious and nationalist agendas.
Ah, I see. So he essentially locks his party's most passionate ideological promises in a drawer just to keep the government from completely collapsing.
That's exactly it. He trades ideological purity for political stability. And with those highly contentious issues strictly off the table, he had to give the government a unified purpose.
Right. They need something else to rally around.
Yes, so he pivoted the entire administration's focus toward a right-wing supply-side economic philosophy. Basically, if they couldn't unite over religion or nationalism, they were going to unite over building roads and selling off state assets.
Which makes sense. And the push for privatization in these documents is aggressive. I mean, they literally created a ministry of disinvestment.
Yeah, that was a huge deal.
It's one thing to quietly sell off a few government shares here and there, but elevating it to a full cabinet-level ministry, that sends a very loud signal. It's the government boldly stating that the state is a terrible businessman and it needs to get out of the boardroom.
It was a radical shift in the Indian context, for sure. Because for decades post-independence, the Indian economy was defined by heavy state control, which was often called the license Raj.
Where the government ran practically everything.
Exactly, everything from airlines to bread factories. The 1991 reforms had started dismantling this, but Vajpayee's government really accelerated it. The philosophy was straightforward. The state should facilitate business, not run it.
Right.
So they began selling off government-owned hotels, telecom companies, manufacturing units. But the real crown jewel of this economic push wasn't actually what they sold, it was what they built. The Golden Quadrilateral.
The massive highway project.
Yes.
The sources describe this as attempting to connect the four major corners of the country, so Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata, with thousands of kilometers of high-speed, multi-lane highways. It's pitched as creating the physical arteries for a completely fragmented market.
And it was desperately needed. The logistics were a nightmare before that.
And reading the economic data from around 2003, it genuinely seemed to be working. I mean, the economy was booming. The country had a great monsoon season, which obviously boosted agriculture, and foreign exchange reserves were just overflowing.
The optimism was palpable in the cities.
Right. And they were feeling so confident that the Vajpayee government actually dissolves parliament early. They called for an election in 2004, months ahead of schedule, and they center their entire national campaign on just two words: India Shining.
Yeah, India Shining was a massive, multi-million-dollar advertising blitz. You had these slick television commercials showing happy families, bustling stock markets, shiny new infrastructure.
It looks great on TV.
It was designed to capture the optimism of a rising modern power. And for a specific demographic, the urban middle class, the software engineers in Bangalore, the corporate executives in Mumbai, India, truly was shining for them. They were reaping the benefits of low interest rates and a booming IT sector.
But the sources show this exact slogan became one of the greatest miscalculations in modern democratic history. I mean, the India Shining campaign sounds to me like someone posting only their absolute best, highly filtered highlight reel on social media while completely ignoring the fact that their house is actively on fire in the background.
That is a brutally accurate way to put it.
But I have to push back on the actual mechanics of this failure, because the data shows that hundreds of millions of people in rural areas were suffering from severe agrarian distress. Crops were failing, debts were mounting. How did the politicians, and especially the pollsters, miss this completely? Were they just refusing to look outside the major cities?
What's fascinating here is that the blindness wasn't necessarily malicious. It was a profound symptom of the early 2000s globalization bubble.
How so?
Well, you have to look at where the media, the pollsters, and the political elite were physically located. They lived in the epicenters of this unprecedented wealth generation. They were the ones driving on the new highways. They were the ones using the new mobile networks.
Ah, so they were living the highlight reel.
Exactly. When everyone in your immediate professional and social circle is experiencing a massive boom, it creates an echo chamber. They simply projected that urban euphoria onto a vast, incredibly complex subcontinent.
They mistook the skyline for the whole country.
Precisely. And out in the rural hinterlands, the narrative of India Shining wasn't just inaccurate, it felt like a cruel insult.
I can imagine.
Millions of farmers and rural laborers hadn't tasted a single fruit of these economic reforms. The television was basically telling them they had never had it so good, while they were literally struggling to buy fertilizer. This cognitive dissonance generated a massive silent wave of anti-incumbency that just completely failed to register in urban telephone polls.
Wow. And that silent wave crashed down hard in the May 2004 election. I mean, the results were an absolute shocker. The BJP and its allies lost power. The Indian National Congress, a party that many analysts thought was in terminal decline at that point, suddenly emerged as the single largest party.
No one saw it coming.
And they managed to form a new coalition called the United Progressive Alliance, or UPA, backed by the Left Front. But the drama didn't end with the vote count. The sources detail a leadership scenario that seemed almost unprecedented in a major democracy.
Oh, it was a moment of incredible political theater. So Sonia Gandhi was the president of the Congress Party and the unquestioned architect of this massive victory. By all normal conventions, she was going to be the prime minister.
Right.
But she faced intense vocal opposition from the defeated right wing, who aggressively highlighted her Italian birth and foreign origin. So, in a move that absolutely stunned the nation, she stood before her party members, cited her inner voice, and formally declined the prime ministership.
Just to pause on that for a second, because the context of the Gandhi family is crucial here for the listener. When the sources refer to the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, they aren't talking about Mahatma Gandhi.
Correct, no relation.
They are talking about the family that had essentially ruled India for most of its independent history. Her husband, Rajiv Gandhi, was assassinated. Her mother-in-law, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated. So her stepping away from the highest office, despite having the clear mandate, completely changed the power structure. She hands the reins to Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Yes, Dr. Manmohan Singh, an Oxford-educated economist, a former governor of the central bank, and really the man widely credited with authoring India's 1991 economic liberalization.
A very different kind of leader.
Very different. He was highly respected, soft-spoken, and viewed as politically non-threatening. But this specific arrangement created a highly unusual dual power center in Indian governance.
Explain how that dual center actually functioned day to day, because the sources suggest it was a very delicate balancing act.
It divided the labor of running a country, essentially. Dr. Manmohan Singh headed the government, so he managed the cabinet, the daily economy, and the administration. Sonia Gandhi, meanwhile, headed the UPA coalition itself and managed the politics.
Well, I see.
Yeah, she was the chairperson of the National Advisory Council, which was a body heavily populated by civil society activists and grassroots organizers. This division meant that the economic pragmatists in the government were often checking and balancing the social welfare idealists in the party, and vice versa.
And they also had another massive check on their power, didn't they? They didn't have a majority on their own. They relied on the outside support of 61 members of parliament from the Left Front, so communist and Marxist parties.
That was the catch.
The sources point out that because of this specific mathematical reality in Parliament, the government's entire policy paradigm just had to shift. They couldn't just continue the BJP's relentless focus on supply-side economics and privatization. The left just wouldn't allow it.
The political math forced a philosophical pivot. The UPA government had to adopt a rights-based, inclusive welfare model. The massive mandate of 2004 was interpreted as a loud cry from the rural poor demanding a share of the growth.
Right.
They realized that if the state didn't actively redistribute some of this new wealth, the social fabric of the country would basically tear.
And this brings us to what I find to be one of the most fascinating transitions in the documents. Because the UPA's new power dynamic didn't just change the names on the ministers' doors. It fundamentally rewrote the social contract between the Indian state and its poorest citizens.
It was a huge paradigm shift.
We are looking at a legislative revolution in the mid-2000s that moved away from the idea of the government handing out benefits as a form of charity to a system where citizens possessed legally enforceable rights.
It was a profound legal and psychological shift. The defining legacy of this era, which is often called UPAI, is built on two monumental pieces of legislation. The first is the Right to Information Act, or RTI, which was passed in 2005.
Okay, tell us about that.
To really understand its impact, you have to understand the culture it replaced. Since the colonial era, Indian governance was heavily protected by the Official Secrets Act. The default stance of the bureaucracy was absolute impenetrable opacity.
Wow.
The citizen had zero right to know how decisions were made, how contracts were awarded, or where the tax money actually went.
It was the ultimate file culture, right, where a paper file moving slowly across a dusty desk held immense power over a person's life. But the sources describe the RTI Act as shattering that secrecy. Walk us through the actual mechanics of how this empowered a normal citizen.
The mechanics were brilliantly simple, and that was the key to its success. Any citizen could write a request for information from a public authority on just a plain piece of paper, pay a nominal fee, usually about 10 rupees, and submit it.
10 rupees is basically nothing.
Exactly. But the revolutionary part was the legal mandate attached to it. The government official, the public information officer, had exactly 30 days to provide the requested information.
And if they didn't?
If they failed or if they provided false information, they faced personal financial penalties deducted directly from their own salary.
Wait, really? That is incredible leverage.
Yeah.
You are taking the immense, intimidating power of the traditional Indian bureaucrat and making them personally financially liable to the public.
It completely flipped the power dynamic.
The sources mention that in rural districts, ordinary citizens actually started using RTI to conduct their own public audits. Like, they were demanding to see the muster rolls, the attendance sheets for local government construction projects.
And through those citizen audits, they were exposing massive localized corruption. They would find ghost workers on the payroll, people who didn't exist or had died years ago, but whose daily wages were being pocketed by corrupt local contractors. RTI became a very real weapon for the common man against everyday graft.
And then there's the second pillar of this new social contract, which was the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, known as NREGA, which was also passed in 2005. Reading through the parameters of this program, the logistical scale is just mind-boggling.
It was ambitious on a level rarely seen.
It guaranteed 100 days of wage employment every single year to every rural household whose adult members volunteered for unskilled manual work.
Yeah, NREGA was the direct structural response to that rural anger that voted out the Vajpayee government. It was designed as the ultimate social safety net. And again, the mechanics of the law are what made it historic. It was entirely demand-driven.
Right. It wasn't a government program that periodically just decided to build a road and hire some people.
Exactly. The citizen initiated the process. A rural worker could walk into their local village council, demand work, and the state was legally obligated to provide it within 15 days.
And what kind of work was this?
Usually involving manual labor like digging ponds, building check dams, or rural roads. And here's the kicker. If the government failed to provide the work within that 15-day time frame, they were legally liable to pay the worker an unemployment allowance anyway.
Wow. The data in the sources shows it was an absolute game changer, particularly for women. Because the law mandated equal pay for men and women, and the work was localized, women made up nearly 80% of the workforce in some regions.
It gave millions of women their first truly independent source of income.
And it also set a hard floor for rural wages, right? Private landowners and contractors suddenly had to pay more because workers now had a guaranteed government alternative.
It injected billions of rupees directly into the rural economy, which boosted consumption from the bottom up. But to be fair, it was also heavily criticized. Opponents argued it was a massive drain on the exchequer, that it created inflationary pressures, and that it resulted in poor quality, unproductive assets like, digging ditches just to fill them back up.
So we have RTI effectively taking power from the bureaucrat and handing it to the villager. And we have NREGA legally empowering the rural worker. It feels like the peak of democratic transparency and welfare.
On paper, yes.
But then, the sources outline a political crisis in 2008 that provides a really jarring contrast. The Left Front decides to withdraw its support from the UPA coalition over a foreign policy disagreement, the Indo-US civil nuclear deal.
A very tense moment.
The government is suddenly thrust into a minority, leading to this dramatic trust vote in Parliament. And during this live televised confidence vote, we literally see opposition politicians walking into the well of the parliament and waving bundles of raw cash, alleging they were offered bribes to vote for the government.
The infamous cash for votes scandal.
Yes. How do you reconcile this simultaneous peak of idealistic democratic transparency with the absolute peak of ruthless, backroom political dealing?
It is the ultimate paradox of a maturing democracy, honestly. And it really highlights the dual nature of the UPA government we discussed earlier. The RTI and NREGA represented the ideological, idealistic wing of the government, driven heavily by Sonia Gandhi's National Advisory Council and those grassroots activists.
Right.
But the 2008 trust vote represented the raw, unvarnished mechanics of survival.
Because when the Left Front pulled out, Manmohan Singh's government was literally hours away from collapsing.
Yes, and surviving that required a masterclass in political realism. They had to frantically search for new allies, which led them to reach out to their former fierce rivals, the Samajwadi Party in Uttar Pradesh, just to secure the numbers.
Just to stay alive.
Exactly. The cash for votes scandal, while deeply corrosive to public trust, was the ugly symptom of this desperate scramble. However, while the optics were terrible, the outcome of that survival was highly consequential for the trajectory of the entire decade.
Because shedding the left front's ideological constraints actually unshackled Manmohan Singh. The sources point out that once the communist parties were no longer holding veto power over his agenda, he was suddenly free to aggressively pursue not just the nuclear deal, but a much broader agenda of global economic integration.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he didn't have to constantly negotiate every minor economic reform anymore. This political survival allowed the government to keep its foot heavily on the gas pedal of the economy.
And the timing was perfect.
It was, because right at this moment, the seeds planted by Vajpayee's infrastructure push and the UPA's rural consumption boost were converging. India was entering a period of unprecedented, dizzying economic acceleration. We are talking about the golden phase of the Indian economy.
The numbers in the sources from this period almost don't look real for a democracy of this size. From 2003 to 2008, the economy grew at an astonishing average of 8.8%. In the fiscal years of 2006-07 and 2007-08, it actually touched 9%.
Which is staggering.
India was suddenly being mentioned in the exact same breath as China in global financial circles. The Hindu rate of growth was officially dead and buried.
It was a total paradigm shift, and you could see this growth manifesting physically across the landscape. The infrastructure projects conceptualized in the late 90s and early 2000s were finally coming online.
We mentioned the Golden Quadrilateral earlier, that massive highway network. By the end of the decade, nearly 98% of it was completed. And underneath the cities, you had a similar physical revolution. The sources highlight the Delhi Metro, which started operations in 2002 under a man named Es Renan.
Oh, the Metro Man.
Yeah. What makes this project stand out in the documents is the incredible emphasis on execution. Indian public infrastructure projects were notoriously plagued by delays, cost overruns, and red tape. But Sridharan demanded absolute autonomy from political interference. The Delhi Metro was built world-class, on time, and within budget.
Sridharan's methodology was as important as the trains themselves. He basically proved that the Indian state apparatus could execute complex, massive engineering projects at a global standard.
It proved it was possible.
Right. It shattered a long-held domestic cynicism and sparked a metro rail revolution across other megacities like Bangalore and Mumbai. But going back to the Golden Quadrilateral for a second, it's vital to understand that it wasn't just asphalt linking cities. It functioned as a massive, continuous economic corridor.
Explain how that changes the local economies it actually passes through.
Well, the economic data in these sources shows that districts located along the highway network saw significantly higher rates of new business entry, particularly in manufacturing, compared to areas situated further away.
That makes sense.
Before this, India was deeply fragmented. Moving goods from north to south took weeks due to terrible roads and endless interstate checkpoints. The new highways drove down logistics costs, allowed inventory to move at unprecedented speeds, and essentially unified the domestic market into one cohesive unit.
So the roads connected the goods. But the sources show that the telecom sector is what connected the minds. And this is where the mechanics of the transformation get really interesting.
Oh, the telecom boom is wild.
At the start of the decade, as we mentioned, a mobile phone was a luxury. Incoming calls are actually charged to the receiver.
Imagine paying just to answer your phone.
I know, but the government changed the policy to calling party pays, and suddenly the market started to move. But the defining, explosive moment happens toward the end of the decade, in 2009, when Tata Docomo enters the market.
Tata Docomo completely disrupted the industry norm. Until then, telecom operators billed customers per minute. If you spoke for 61 seconds, you paid for 2 full minutes.
Which is incredibly annoying.
Highly profitable for the companies, but terribly restrictive for a highly price-sensitive population. Tata Docomo introduced the 1 paisa per second billing model.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's like switching from paying for an entire massive buffet that you can't possibly finish to strictly paying per byte.
That's a great way to look at it.
It fundamentally shifted the economics of communication. It suddenly made the mobile phone accessible to that fisherman we talked about, or a daily wage laborer. You only paid for the exact seconds you consumed.
That buffet analogy perfectly captures the structural shift. It triggered a ruthless price war among the telecom operators. They all had to slash their rates to match, which ultimately made Indian telecom tariffs the lowest anywhere in the world.
The statistics from the sources are staggering on this. We are looking at a jump from just under 2 million wireless subscribers in the year 2000 to over 391 million by March 2009.
391 million, let that sink in.
391 million people coming online. The tel density, the number of phones per 100 people, went from 7 to 37.
It was an explosion of mass connectivity. It democratized information access practically overnight. Suddenly, supply chains were more efficient, money could be transferred via text, and millions of people who had never even had a landline in their lives leapfrogged directly into the wireless age.
And we saw a very similar democratization happening in the sky. Until 2003, flying in India was essentially a luxury monopoly dominated by state carriers and a couple of premium private airlines.
Only the rich flew.
Exactly. Fares were incredibly high. The middle class took trains. Then, Captain G.R. Gopinath launches Air Deccan, India's first low-cost carrier. The sources say his explicit vision was to make the common man fly. He wanted to bring the economics of the local Udupi diner to aviation. He introduced promotional fares for as low as 1 rupee.
Air Deccan basically stripped away all the frills. No free meals, fast turnaround times, high-density seating.
Bare bones.
Completely. And while Air Deccan itself eventually struggled financially and had to merge with a larger carrier, its entry permanently altered the DNA of the aviation market. It broke the psychological barrier that flying was only for the elite.
Right.
It forced the entry of other successful low-cost carriers like Indigo and SpiceJet. By the end of the decade, the domestic terminals at Indian airports were starting to look like bustling railway stations. The great Indian middle class was taking to the skies.
But this soaring 9% dream, this feeling of total invincibility, hits a massive wall of reality in 2008, the global financial crisis.
There's a crash.
Global liquidity dries up, Lehman Brothers collapses in the U.S., and India feels the shockwaves immediately. Foreign institutional investors pulled billions out of the Indian stock market, causing it to crash. Export demand plummets. GDP growth drops sharply from 9% down to 6.7%.
Up until that exact point, there had been a very popular theory circulating among economists called decoupling. Yeah, it was the idea that massive emerging economies like India and China had built enough internal momentum that they could just keep growing regardless of a recession in the West.
Spoiler alert, they couldn't.
Exactly. The 2008 crash shattered the decoupling myth completely. It proved that India was inextricably linked to the global financial system.
But the sources detail how the Indian government responded to prevent a total economic stall. They executed a classic Keynesian stimulus. For a listener who might not remember their Econ 101, what does that actually mean in practice?
So the basic theory of John Maynard Keynes is that during an economic downturn, when private businesses and consumers stop spending out of fear, the government must step in and spend aggressively to artificially stimulate demand and keep the economy moving.
Pump money into the system.
Yes. In 2008, the Indian government slashed indirect taxes to make goods cheaper. They ramped up massive public expenditure on infrastructure and rural programs like NREGA. Simultaneously, the Reserve Bank of India aggressively cut interest rates, making it very cheap for banks to lend and businesses to borrow.
And reading the immediate aftermath, the stimulus seemed to work beautifully. The economy rebounded quickly, hitting 8.6% growth the very next year. The sources note that India's domestic banking system wasn't heavily exposed to the toxic subprime mortgages that destroyed Western banks, which essentially saved them from a banking collapse.
It worked flawlessly in the short term. The fire was put out. But it's really crucial to look at the long-term trade-offs detailed in these documents.
There's always a catch.
Always. When you pump that much cheap money into an economy and dramatically widen the fiscal deficit, there is a price to pay later. That aggressive fiscal expansion planted the deep seeds for the double-digit inflation and currency vulnerabilities that would severely punish the Indian economy in the subsequent decade.
Ah, so a delayed reaction.
Exactly. It was a harsh lesson in the complex, double-edged sword of global economic integration.
And as India's economy physically and digitally integrated with the globe, its foreign policy had to adapt to this new reality. A nation growing at 9%, consuming vast amounts of energy, and attracting billions in foreign investment couldn't remain isolated.
No, it had to step up.
It had to shed its historic hesitation and forcefully assert this new economic weight on the world stage. Which brings us to perhaps the most significant diplomatic pivot of the 2000s, the Indo-US civil nuclear deal.
To understand the sheer magnitude of this deal, you have to look at India's global standing prior to it.
Which was complicated.
Very. Since conducting nuclear tests in 1974 and again in 1998, India had been treated as a nuclear pariah. Because India consistently refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, arguing it was inherently discriminatory, dividing the world into nuclear haves and have-nots, it was subjected to severe global technology and diplomatic embargoes. The Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which was initiated in 2005 by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and U.S. President George W. Bush, was a diplomatic masterpiece that essentially ended 30 years of nuclear apartheid.
I'm looking at the mechanics of the deal in the sources, and it sounds like a logistical and legal nightmare to pull off. India essentially agreed to physically separate its civilian nuclear energy facilities from its military nuclear weapons facilities.
Which is no small feat.
Right. They then agreed to place all the civilian facilities under the permanent safeguards and watch of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. In return, the U.S. agreed to resume full civil nuclear cooperation, giving India access to the global uranium market and advanced reactor technology. But the friction here wasn't just in India separating its grid, it was in Washington.
What is truly remarkable about this agreement is how much it forced the established global order to bend just to accommodate India. The United States executive branch couldn't just sign this deal. They actually had to go to Congress and amend their own domestic laws.
That's wild.
They passed the Hyde Act specifically to modify the U.S. Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which explicitly forbade nuclear trade with non-NPT states.
The U.S. literally changed its own laws to make room for India's rise. And they didn't stop there.
No, they didn't. The U.S. then had to use its immense diplomatic muscle to heavily lobby the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is a cartel of 48 nations that controls global nuclear trade, to grant India a unique, unprecedented waiver.
So it effectively recognized India as a de facto legitimate nuclear weapons state without India ever having to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The sources use a very specific phrase here. They note it dehyphenated India from Pakistan in the American strategic calculus.
Yes, that hyphen is crucial.
For decades, U.S. foreign policy viewed South Asia strictly through the lens of the India-Pakistan rivalry. This deal signaled that Washington now viewed India as an independent, rising global power, completely separate from its regional conflicts.
It elevated India's status permanently.
But while relations with the U.S. were reaching historic, unprecedented highs, relations with its immediate neighbor, Pakistan, were incredibly volatile. We see this violent pendulum swinging from grand peace overtures to the brink of all-out nuclear-armed war.
The decade actually started with very high hopes for peace. In 2001, Prime Minister Vajpayee invited Pakistan's military ruler, General Pervez Musharraf, to a grand summit in the historical city of Agra.
But the Agra summit was doomed before it even began, right? Due to fundamentally incompatible prerequisites between the two nations.
Completely doomed.
Break down that incompatibility for us. Why did it collapse without them even issuing a basic joint statement?
It came down to the definition of the core problem. General Musharraf insisted that the territorial dispute over Kashmir was the central, non-negotiable issue, and no broader peace could be discussed without resolving it first.
Okay, and India's stance.
India, however, demanded a complete cessation of cross-border terrorism militants crossing the line of control into Kashmir before any territorial or diplomatic progress could be made. Neither side could concede their starting premise, and the summit collapsed spectacularly.
And that failure of diplomacy cast a very dark, very long shadow over the subcontinent. Because just months later, in December 2001, 5 heavily armed terrorists bypassed security and attacked the Indian Parliament complex in New Delhi while it was in session.
A horrifying event.
The Indian government blamed Pakistan-based militant groups. In response, India launched Operation Parakram. The sources describe this as the largest military mobilization since the 1971 war. They moved nearly 500,000 troops, tanks, and artillery to the border.
A massive display of force.
And then they just stood there,
Yeah.
eyeball to eyeball with Pakistani forces for 10 agonizing months. But I have to challenge the strategic value of this move based on the military analysis and the sources. You mobilize 500,000 troops for almost a year without crossing the border. Does that actually project strength? Or does the fact that it took weeks to mobilize that massive force actually expose a glaring logistical weakness to your adversaries?
That is exactly the fierce debate that consumed military strategists in the aftermath of Parakram. The political intent was an exercise in coercive diplomacy.
Meaning what exactly?
India wanted to generate enough threat of a catastrophic war to force the international community, specifically the U.S., which was currently fighting in Afghanistan, to heavily pressure Pakistan to crack down on militant groups.
And did it work?
Initially, yes, it forced international attention and resulted in some diplomatic concessions, but militarily it was deeply flawed. The sluggish pace of that massive mobilization exposed profound doctrinal and logistical weaknesses.
How slow was it?
It took the Indian Army Strike Corps nearly 3 weeks to move from their peacetime bases in the country's interior to the western border. By the time they were fully positioned and ready to attack, international pressure had already locked the geopolitical situation in place, making a decisive surprise strike impossible.
So they basically lost the element of surprise while they were still loading the trains.
Exactly. And this realization led Indian military thinkers to completely overhaul their strategy. It birthed the Cold Start Doctrine.
Gold Star.
Yes, which reorganized the army into smaller, highly integrated battle groups positioned closer to the border. They were designed to launch rapid, shallow, punitive strikes into enemy territory within 48 hours, long before the international community could intervene or the nuclear threshold was crossed.
So while the Indian state was pouring massive resources into securing its external borders, modernizing its military doctrines, and elevating its global diplomatic status, a terrifying mutation of violence was brewing deep within its own cities and communities.
It was a very dark shift.
And this takes us to the crucible of internal security in the 2000s. To lay out the facts from our sources objectively, because this remained one of the most polarizing events in modern Indian history. On the morning of February 27, 2002, the Sabarmati Express train, which was carrying Hindu pilgrims returning from the disputed site in Ayodhya, was stopped and set on fire by a mob near the Godhra railway station in Gujarat.
A horrific tragedy.
59 people were trapped inside and killed. This horrific event triggered a massive, systematic wave of retaliatory violence across the state, specifically targeting the Muslim community. Official government figures place the death toll at over 1,000 people, the vast majority of them Muslims, though independent and unofficial estimates are significantly higher.
The scale of the violence was immense.
The sources detail severe allegations that the state government, which was led at the time by Chief Minister Narendra Modi and the local police force, either failed to control the violence or were complicit in allowing it to spread. This led to unprecedented intervention by the Supreme Court of India, which constituted a special investigation team to monitor the cases and even transferred key trials completely out of the state to ensure a fair process.
The trauma of the 2002 riots deeply polarized the nation. It created a profound political fault line that continues to shape Indian elections today. But as the decade progressed, the internal security threat began to mutate away from localized communal riots and into something new.
Right.
Intelligence agencies started noticing the rise of homegrown pan-India urban terrorism. This was most notably driven by a shadow group calling itself the Indian Mujahideen, or the IM.
The sources outlined a very specific, calculated urban campaign by the IM in the mid-2000s. They weren't fighting an insurgency in a border state. They were explicitly targeting the rising middle class in spaces of everyday leisure and commerce. There were the 2006 Mumbai local train bombings that killed over 180 daily commuters. And 2008 was a particularly brutal year, with synchronized blasts ripping through crowded markets in Jaipur, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, and the capital, Delhi.
The panic was widespread.
The sources mention a chilling detail. The IM would often use hacked proxy servers to send emails to major media houses just 5 minutes before the blast, basically taunting the authorities and explaining their motives. When terror shifts from a distant border conflict to the local cafes, the shopping markets, and the commuter trains of your financial capital, how does that fundamentally rewire the psychological safety of the average citizen you're talking to?
This raises an important question about the strategic objectives of modern urban terrorism. The shift to city centers wasn't just about maximizing casualties, it was about maximizing psychological disruption.
Creating fear in everyday life.
Right. By attacking people on their way to work or while shopping for festivals, the perpetrators sought to inject a pervasive, inescapable vulnerability into the everyday life of the new, affluent Indian middle class. It shattered the illusion that economic prosperity, gated communities, and new highways offered any sort of impermeable shield against violence.
And this psychological warfare, this sense of vulnerability, reached its terrifying absolute apex at the very end of the decade. the defining trauma of 26/11.
A day that changed everything.
On the night of November 26, 2008, 10 heavily armed terrorists belonging to the Pakistan-based militant group Lashkar-e-Taiba infiltrated the city of Mumbai by sea, hijacking a fishing boat called the Kuber to evade coastal patrols. For the next 60 hours, they held the financial capital of the country hostage in a rolling, multi-site attack.
The strategic intent behind 26/11 was profoundly cynical and highly calculated for the television age. They targeted iconic, heavily populated landmarks, the bustling Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus railway station, the popular Leopold Cafe, a Jewish community center at Nariman House, and most visibly, the luxurious Taj Mahal Palace Hotel.
Why the Kaj?
They were explicitly attacking the physical symbols of India's new globalized wealth and international connectivity. The enduring image of the Taj Hotel's magnificent dome engulfed in black smoke and flames, broadcast live on news networks around the world, was designed to shatter the myth of India as a secure, rising superpower.
The attacks left 166 people dead, including many foreign nationals. But reading through the post-action reports of the sources, the tragedy exposed glaring, catastrophic, systemic failures in the state's response.
The systemic paralysis was shocking.
The local Mumbai police were incredibly brave, but severely outgunned, facing automatic weapons and grenades with outdated rifles. And the elite National Security Guard commandos, the force specifically trained for hostage situations, took over 12 hours to even arrive on the scene because they were based in Delhi and faced severe logistical and transport bottlenecks.
The sheer horror and the visible systemic paralysis of 26/11 forced the Indian state to rapidly, almost desperately, modernize its internal security apparatus. The public outrage was unprecedented.
Understandably so.
It led to the immediate resignation of the Home Minister. It sparked a massive, overdue upgrade in coastal security and naval coordination. And most significantly, it led to the creation of the National Investigation Agency, the NIA.
What did the NIA do differently?
Until then, terrorism was largely treated as a state-level law and order issue. The NIA was established to investigate and prosecute terror cases at a unified federal level. Diplomatically, India suspended its composite dialogue peace process with Pakistan, demanding absolute accountability and the prosecution of the attack's masterminds.
As if these man-made horrors, from localized riots to synchronized urban bombings to international sieges, weren't enough to test the resilience of the nation. The sources show that the 2000s also unleashed some of the most devastating natural furies the subcontinent had ever seen.
The physical geography of India was violently tested 3 separate times in this decade.
And much like the response to the security failures of 26/11, the sheer scale of these natural disasters required the state to completely rethink how it managed catastrophes. It began right at the start of the decade, in January 2001, with a massive 7.7 magnitude earthquake in the Kutch region of Gujarat.
The destruction was apocalyptic. Entire towns were flattened in seconds, including the epicenter in Bhuj, and several high-rise residential buildings collapsed hundreds of kilometers away in the city of Ahmedabad. Over 20,000 lives were lost in the rubble.
But the sources point out a fascinating consequence of this tragedy. The reconstruction effort actually became a global model for post-disaster recovery.
It did. The state government eventually adopted an owner-driven reconstruction strategy.
Meaning they gave people the tools to rebuild themselves.
Exactly. Instead of the government building generic houses and handing over the keys, they provided financial aid and technical support directly to the survivors to rebuild their own homes according to their specific needs. And the massive influx of international aid, combined with the forced rebuilding of entire infrastructure grids, actually laid the groundwork for the subsequent economic modernization of Gujarat.
But then, just 3 years later, in December 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck.
The 2004 tsunami was a tragedy of unimaginable geographic proportions. Triggered by a massive undersea megathrust earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, the resulting waves traveled across the ocean and slammed into India's eastern coast, particularly devastating the state of Tamil Nadu and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
And the death toll was massive.
Over 10,000 people were killed in India alone, not to mention the hundreds of thousands across Southeast Asia. The critical failure highlighted in the Indian context was informational. India simply had no early warning system in place for tsunamis. The waves hit completely without warning.
And that devastating exposure led directly to the establishment of the Indian Tsunami Early Warning Center, the ITTWC, utilizing a network of deep ocean buoys and seismic stations to ensure the country would never be caught completely blind by the ocean again.
A vital piece of infrastructure.
And then we have the third major natural event, The Mumbai floods of July 2005. The city received an incomprehensible 944 millimeters of rain, nearly 37 inches, in just 24 hours.
The entire financial capital of the country completely drowned.
Transport networks failed, the airport shut down, power was cut, and communication lines snapped. 1,000 people died, many trapped in their submerged vehicles. Looking at the data on this, I see the Mumbai floods like a massive stress test on a booming tech company's IP server.
Oh, that's interesting.
The economy was generating billions of dollars, the corporate balance sheets looked amazing, but the physical hardware, the drainage systems, the roads, the encroached rivers, completely crashed under pressure. It revealed the very dark, neglected side of rapid, unplanned urbanization.
The server analogy is highly accurate. The Mumbai floods demonstrated that generating immense economic wealth means absolutely nothing if you build it on crumbling, compromised ecological foundations.
It's basically a house of cards.
Exactly. The disaster wasn't just an act of God, it was an act of terrible municipal planning. The aggressive real estate encroachment on natural drainage channels, specifically the Mithi River, and the rampant destruction of the coastal mangroves had stripped away the city's natural hydraulic defenses. Water simply had nowhere to go.
So what did they learn from all this?
What we see across these three distinct disasters, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the floods, is a forced institutional evolution. The Indian state had to transition from a sluggish, reactive relief model arriving days after the fact with blankets and food packets to a proactive disaster management paradigm aimed at building institutional resilience, enforcing building codes, and establishing early warning networks.
It's heavy. It's a lot of trauma for one decade. But despite the profound trauma of terrorism and these massive natural disasters, the sheer economic wealth and global exposure of the 2000s were actively breeding a fiercely confident, highly expressive new generation. And this generation was about to change Indian culture forever.
The cultural shift was incredible to watch.
We moved from the construction of infrastructure to the construction of identity. And the most visible arena for this shift was the multiplex.
The cultural metamorphosis of the 2000s is deeply, inextricably tied to the economic liberalization we discussed in the first half of the decade. A new consumerist middle class emerged with disposable income, and they fundamentally changed the media and entertainment landscapes.
All right.
The architectural symbol of this was the rise of the multiplex cinema.
Chains like PVR and INOX started appearing inside new air-conditioned urban malls. And the sources note this wasn't just a shift in real estate or seat comfort. It fundamentally changed the economics of the stories being told.
It changed the math of filmmaking.
Before the 2000s, Bollywood largely relied on massive single-screen theaters that held 1,000 people. To turn a profit in those halls, a filmmaker had to appeal to the lowest common denominator. You needed action, romance, comedy, and 6 songs all jammed into one 3-hour movie to please everyone from the urban worker to the rural farmer.
The classic masala film.
Exactly. But multiplexes had smaller, 200-seat screens and charged much higher ticket prices to an affluent audience. Suddenly, niche, urban, purely conceptual films became commercially viable. This birthed what the sources call New Bollywood.
We see this vividly in films like Dil Chahta Hai, released in 2001. It was a massive cultural watershed for the youth.
How so?
Well, instead of the traditional melodramatic family caricatures or angry vigilante heroes, it depicted modern urban youth as relatable, flawed individuals dealing with contemporary concepts of friendship, evolving romance, and career confusion. It introduced a slick, cosmopolitan aesthetic that resonated deeply with a generation that finally felt their specific reality was being seen on screen.
And then, a few years later, you have films like Rang de Basanti in 2006, which tapped into a growing, restless youth frustration with systemic corruption and political apathy.
Yes, the cinema became a mirror for their new assertiveness.
And while cinema was evolving to reflect this new wealth and attitude, the nation's absolute obsession, the sport of cricket, was being completely industrialized.
Oh, the IPL.
In 2008, the Board of Control for Cricket in India, the BCCI, launches the Indian Premier League, the IPL. The mechanics of this are brilliant. They take the fast-paced 3-hour T20 format, which the Indian national team had just won the inaugural World Cup for in 2007, and they fuse it with Bollywood glamour and massive corporate capital.
It was an entertainment juggernaut.
The franchise owners included movie superstars like Shah Rukh Khan and massive industrialists like Mukesh Ambani. They held player auctions where cricketers were bought for millions of dollars. It turned athletes into massive global brands and fundamentally, permanently shifted the financial and administrative tower center of global cricket away from England and Australia directly to India.
The IPL became an annual multi-billion-dollar cultural festival. It blended entertainment, sport, and aggressive capitalism in a way India had never seen.
But alongside this glamorous, highly visible global integration of cricket and cinema, there was another, much more complex sociological phenomena born directly out of the economic outsourcing boom, the call center generation.
Ah, yes. The BPO boom.
This is a fascinating duality to explore. Thanks to the fiber optic cables laid down in the 90s and India's massive English-speaking workforce, Western companies began outsourcing their customer service and back-office IT work to Indian business process outsourcing companies, or BPOs.
It created an entire nocturnal economy.
So you have hundreds of thousands of young Indians working graveyard shifts. They are sleeping during the hot Indian day and working US or UK hours at night. They suddenly have high disposable incomes, they are buying jeans and lattes, and they are living completely out of sync with traditional Indian family rhythms.
Right, their lifestyles totally diverged from their parents.
Yeah. But here's the part that really strikes me in the sources. These workers were often put through intensive training to completely neutralize their Indian accents and adopt Western pseudonyms. So a guy named Suresh, living in Gurgaon, has to introduce himself as Steve to answer a customer service call about a broken washing machine from a guy in Ohio.
The famous accent neutralization classes.
Yeah. And the sources are deeply conflicted on this. Some economists view it as pure global integration and vital economic empowerment. But sociologists argue it's a bizarre, demanding form of cultural erasure just to earn a paycheck. How do you process that tension?
You don't really resolve it. You have to accept that both realities existed simultaneously. That is the defining psychological duality of the BPO worker in the 2000s.
It's a double-edged sword.
On one hand, it represented unprecedented financial independence. This was particularly revolutionary for young women who entered the corporate workforce in massive numbers for the first time, gaining mobility and financial autonomy from their families.
Which is a huge net positive.
But on the other hand, it demanded a daily, exhausting, performative negation of their own identity. Being culturally Indian by day and adopting an American persona by night created a profound psychological dissonance. But what is crucial to take away from this era is that this new middle class, whether they were earning their own money in a call center or watching rebellious films like Rang de Basanti in a multiplex, was shedding its traditional fatalistic apathy.
You were waking up?
They were finding their voice and they were realizing their collective power.
And that collective voice roared to life in the real world during the Jessica Lal case. The facts of the case and the sources are stark. Jessica Lal was a model working as a celebrity bartender at a party in New Delhi in 1999. She was shot dead at point-blank range by Manu Sharma, the son of a powerful, wealthy politician, simply because she refused to serve him a drink after the bar had closed.
A horrific abuse of power.
In 2006, after a long trial, the court acquitted the accused. Dozens of eyewitnesses had simply turned hostile on the stand, clearly intimidated or bought off by political power. But instead of the public just shrugging and accepting that the rich get away with murder, which had been the cynical norm for decades, the public exploded.
The acquittal triggered a massive organic uprising. The headline, "No One Killed Jessica," run by a prominent news magazine, became a nationwide rallying cry. For the first time, we saw the rapid mobilization of the urban middle class through new technology, widespread SMS text messaging campaigns, and early internet petitions.
The sources describe citizens holding massive candlelight vigils at India Gate in the capital. They were completely blurring the line between cinematic rebellion, like the characters marching in Rang de Basanti, and actual real-world civic action.
And the incredible part is, it worked.
It actually worked. The immense public and media pressure forced the Delhi High Court to take the rare step of fast-tracking the appeal. They re-examined the evidence, including sting operations by journalists that proved witness tampering, and they convicted the killer, sentencing him to life in prison.
It marked the birth of a powerful, aggressive media-citizen alliance. This newfound confidence refused to be confined just to the streets, the multiplexes, or the cricket pitches. It literally aimed for the stars.
Which brings us to our final act. India breaking global and gravitational barriers.
The decade concluded with India conquering entirely new frontiers in science and sports, milestones that fundamentally altered its own self-image on the global stage. Let's look at the scientific breakthrough first, Chandrayaan-1.
In October 2008, the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, launches its first unmanned lunar probe. And it's not just a symbolic flyby to plant a flag. The The spacecraft dropped a moon impact probe onto the surface, and utilizing an advanced scanner supplied by NASA, it actually confirmed the widespread presence of water molecules in the lunar soil.
It was a scientific discovery of massive, historic, global importance.
But the detail that stands out most in the sources is the budget. They executed this deep space mission at a fraction of the cost of what Western agencies like NASA or the ESA would spend. I look at Chandrayaan-1 like a scrappy, highly efficient startup completely out-innovating legacy tech giants. It proved to the world that India wasn't just a place to outsource cheap back-office coding to. It was a nation capable of engineering elite deep space discovery.
It was a massive statement of intent. Chandrayaan-1 signaled India's arrival as a serious, capable, and highly efficient spacefaring nation. And that exact same shattering of psychological barriers happened back on Earth in the sporting arena.
Which was long overdue.
For decades, India had suffered from a deeply ingrained sporting inferiority complex, particularly at the Olympic Games. Despite having 1 billion people, the country struggled to produce individual champions outside of field hockey. That psychological block ended on August 11, 2008.
Abhinav Bindra at the Beijing Olympics. He wins the gold medal in the 10-meter air rifle event. It was India's first ever individual Olympic gold medal in the history of the Games.
Bindra's victory was a masterclass in psychological resilience and immense focus. But broadly, it proved to the nation that individual Indian excellence could absolutely dominate on a strictly global, meritocratic stage. He shattered a glass ceiling that had loomed over Indian athletes for over a century.
And we saw a similar, incredibly powerful cultural breakthrough with Sania Mirza in tennis.
Yes, Sania Mirza.
She burst onto the global tennis scene with an absolutely lethal forehand, and by 2005 she became the first Indian woman to win a WTA Tour title. But reading the cultural analysis in the sources, she wasn't just winning tennis matches, she was actively challenging deeply traditional gender norms.
She faced a lot of pushback.
Severe backlash from conservative clerics regarding her on-court apparel, but she handled it with an unapologetic attitude and continued success.
Both Bindra and Mirza became vital, transformative role models. They perfectly embodied the new Indian ethos of the 2000s. Confident, globally competitive, highly individualistic, and completely unafraid to occupy space at the highest levels of achievement.
Looking back at the statistics from our stack of sources, the sheer whiplash of this decade is almost hard to comprehend. We are talking about taking a nation from 2 million mobile users to 391 million.
Unbelievable scale.
We are talking about a foreign exchange reserve that ballooned from a mere $38 billion to over $250 billion, moving the entire psychological framework of the country from a mindset of constant scarcity management to one of abundance.
And through it all, despite the intense political friction, they established a rights-based welfare state through RTI and NREGA that remains the absolute foundation of Indian governance today.
The 2000s wasn't just a 10-year period of time. It was the decade India went through its most violent, exhausting growing pains, and truly grew up. We started this deep dive by comparing India's trajectory to a factory floor being rebuilt while the assembly line is running at 100 miles an hour. It was chaotic, the execution was often flawed, and left many people behind, but the machine they built by the end of it was undeniably massive and permanent.
It was an era of undeniable ascent, but as we've discussed, one that left deep, complex scars. We've seen how this single decade built the physical highways, the digital networks, and the psychological infrastructure of a modern superpower.
Yeah.
But it also proved that extreme, rapid economic growth inherently creates extreme inequalities and deep internal vulnerabilities. The question for you to consider as we wrap up this analysis is this. When a nation of over 1 billion people finally enters its adulthood with this much economic power, this much technological capability, and this much internal friction, does the established global world order eventually adapt to accommodate them? Or do they eventually break the world order to fit their massive new size?
A massive question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives, keep looking at the raw data, and keep exploring the forces that continue to shape our modern world.